In this lecture, you will be learning about dependency injection in Swift, which basically means that you will be able to pass implementations of a particular type and you can interchange them. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a very simple login screen, as you can see on the right-hand side, and we are already using a login view model. But we have to write tests for our login screen, and these tests will be the UI test or user interface test. Currently, you can see that we don't have any testing project added to our solution. So let's go ahead and add a testing project. We can go to Editor, add a target, and you can search for a target for test, and there are multiple types of testing targets. We are going to use a UI testing bundle, and that is all fine, and now it's added. You can see right over here we have our UI test added. Now what we are trying to test is the user interface. So if we go back to the login screen, you can see that login screen is going to perform an actual login, which it is not doing over here. But once it performs a login, and if the login is successful, then we will go ahead and display an image of a lock. All right. Now, this is a UI test. This is not an integration test that we're about to write. So we don't really want to connect to an actual web service or an actual authentication service for our login screen. Currently, we don't even have any service. So probably we should start from there. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder in the pet adoption project, which is services. And I'm going to go ahead and add a brand new file. And I will simply call it web service. The idea of the service is to perform authentication. So we can have different implementations of the authentication. So we're going to create the web service as a protocol. Now we can go ahead and create an actual concrete implementation of that particular web service. And I'm just going to say pet adoption service, which is going to be conforming to the web service. This means that we should provide implementation for the authenticate function and return Boolean. This is our actual service. So it's going to connect to some sort of web API, and it is going to pass in some tokens and all those different things. So let's say that it takes 5 seconds, and then after that, it returns either true or false. But that's our actual service. And when we're doing our authentication or when we're doing our testing for our UI, we certainly don't want to connect to our actual service. Let's go ahead and write our first test. Now, when I'm writing tests, I like to make sure that my tests are very, very descriptive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and first of all start with nothing. And I will go ahead and change even the name of the test. So the test that we're about to write is that when the person enters the username and the password and they click on the login button, then they should see a lock right over here, indicating that their password is correct. But this is the UI test, so we're only testing the UI. We're not going to be, or we don't plan to make a call to an actual web service and perform an authentication. So we will have to think about that later. So what should we write for our test? Well, we will go ahead and write the name of the test. When user fills correct credentials and press login button. You can see that how descriptive my test name is. And now I can go ahead and create setup and actual test. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and create app, which is going to allow me to access different elements inside my test. And now I can go ahead and say setup. We will call super.setup. Setup function is going to get called, well, not this one. Make sure that this is not the class one, but the instance setup function is going to get called whenever the test is run. So this setup function is going to get called when each test or before each test is going to run. Next, we can go ahead and create application, XCUI application. And we can go ahead and say app.launch. Perfect. So if we run this right now, it's simply going to launch our application. But we also need to write our test. So let's go ahead and write our test. Test should display lock successfully. Great, that's the name of the test. Okay, so what should our test do? Well, our test should launch the login screen, which we can see it should fill up something for the username, something for the password, click the button, and then check if the lock is being displayed, the image of a lock is being displayed or not. The way that we access the username, password, and all the different elements in SwiftUI currently is by using accessibility identifier. Since I have already placed these accessibility identifier in our SwiftUI application, I can go ahead and use them to access each element in my test. So let's go ahead and get the username text field, the password text field, as well as a button. The syntax is actually pretty simple. We use the app, which is XCUI application, and we check in the text fields using the accessibility identifier. Once we have the text fields, button, and the password, we can go ahead and make our task name text field. Actually, it should be called username text field. So username text field. We should click on the username text field, and we should make sure that the username text field is active. Once it is active, we can go ahead and start typing something in the username text field, which is using the type text. And that will be the username. Next, we can click on the password text field and write some sort of a password. And finally, we can click on the login button, which is simply tapping on the button. Next, we can go ahead and get the image. So image of a lock, which we can get from self.app.images and passing in the name or the accessibility modifier of that particular image. And we can see if that actually exists or not. So xc assert true, image lock.exists. And this will be our test. Now let's go ahead and run our test and see what happens. Now the first time, since we're running the test, it may take a little bit of time, but we'll have to see that if it goes and populate everything or not. Sometimes you have to adjust some settings in the simulator. So we will see that if the test is actually launching. And once again, since this is the first time we are running, it is going to take a while for our test to launch. But once the test is launched, it's going to launch quite quickly for the next or the future time when you're running the test. Okay, there we go. The app is installed. It's launched. Now we need to see that if the username and the password text field and the login button, everything is set up. Now, first problem that we see right now is our page, the one that we just created, login screen, is actually not the main screen. So we need to make sure that login screen is the main screen. So we will simply say login screen. And you can even delete the content view, which is added by default. Now, the login screen is missing an argument. It actually does want a login view model. So let's go ahead and create a login view model, which is login view model. And we can go ahead and pass it. Okay, great. Let's go back to the test and try to run it again. And hopefully this time it is going to launch the test that we are running and the screen that we want. There we go. Now let's see if it actually can type into those fields, like the username and the password. Okay, so we had some problems again. In order to fix this problem, let's go ahead and check out some of the settings for our simulator. Make sure that the simulator is selected, and you can see over here that connect hardware keyboard is checked out. That looks fine. Let's go ahead and see what else we can do. So in order to fix this problem, let's go to your I/O keyboard. You can see that connect hardware keyboard is actually off, which is good. But sometimes you have to kind of like toggle it again to make it active, which is kind of like a bug in your Xcode or your simulator. Let's go ahead and toggle it and turn it back on. You can see it's back on. Now turn it off again. There we go. All right. Now let's go ahead and run our test again. We just want to see that if our test is able to write the username and the password and click on the login button. So here it is. It's launching. It's able to write everything, but it actually fails on the last line because even though our username and password might be correct, the image doesn't exist. Okay. So how can we fix this problem? Well, if you go back to your login view models or the view model in general, you can see the view model doesn't really have any access to the service. So probably we want to do that. So this is a dependency that we want to create for our login view model, that in order to create a login view model, you should pass in a service. Now for the service, we are going to use a protocol. This means that you can pass in any service which is conforming to the web service protocol. Next, we will need to create our initializer for the login view model, keeping in mind that web service is a protocol. So you can pass in any kind of a service that is conforming to that particular protocol. So there we go. We're passing in the web service. We should also probably have some sort of a login function. So let's go ahead and create a login function. This is all inside our view model. This will be string. We will take the password also. And then we will call self.isAuthenticated, whatever the web service is going to return. So self.service.authenticate, passing in the username and passing in the password. Since the isAuthenticated property is marked with publish, we need to make sure that we are configuring it or setting it inside the main. So dispatch queue.main.async. Let's go ahead and put this inside over here. Perfect. Now, since we have created the initializer and we have added a dependency to a web service, it will break somewhere. And the reason is that, well, we haven't really passed in the login view model. So how can we do that? How can we pass in the login view model? There are multiple ways of passing in the login view model or the service. Let's go ahead and see one of them. What about if we have the service and we simply pass in the pet adoption service? This is the real service, like an actual service that is going to go connect with an API, pass in the tokens, get the result. So this is a production service that you are doing. Now we need to also go and make sure that this service is actually added somewhere else. You can see right over here in the previews, we also need to add that service. And this is pet adoption service. Great. Now let's go ahead and run our test. Now keep in mind that when we are performing an actual login in our test, that login is contacting the actual development or production service and then getting us the result. So you can see that still it is failing. The reason may be that the service is going to return you after a long time or something like that. Well, another reason is we didn't really even do the login part. So that might be the main reason. So let's go ahead and do that also. Login view model.login, passing in the username, which is username, and passing in the password. There we go. Okay, so now we are actually using the login view model.login function. Let's go ahead and try to run it again. Keeping in mind that we are connecting to a actual service, which is going to make an actual call, sleep for 5 seconds, and then it's going to return. So we will do all of that. And you can see it's waiting for 5 seconds. Hopefully the test will pass. There we go. Test is passing. So this is good. But the problem is that we had to connect to an actual service, which is over here, the pet adoption service. And that made the actual call, which took a lot of time. But we were not really checking the service, or we were not testing the service. We are here to test the UI. So in other words, we can go ahead and create some sort of a fake service and use that instead of using the real service. So let's go and create a fake service. The fake service will also conform to the web service protocol. There we go. You can see the fake service is not making a call to an actual service. It's not sleeping on anything. And we are using true. If you had other functions inside the web service, you can also add that to the fake service. So a fake service is always going to return you a predetermined response, and it will be very quick. And the reason is that we are not really checking the web service. We are more interested in the UI testing rather than making an actual call. This is not an integration test that you're writing. We're writing the UI testing. But now we have a kind of a problem. When we are in our code, if we go to our pet adoption app, you can see that we are injecting pet adoption service. Now, if I go ahead and simply change it to a fake authentication service, it's going to work, but what about if we are deploying it to production? Now it will always use fake authentication service. So we need to fix that problem. So how can we fix it? Well, one of the things that you can do is inside your UI testing, you can make sure to pass some sort of a launch environment which can be intercepted in your actual application. And based on those environment values, the actual app can switch between the two services. In order to pass launch environment, we can simply say app equals to launch environment. Make sure that you use launch environment and not launch arguments. They're completely different things. env, which is test. So this is simply a dictionary. We're providing our own custom key, env, and the value is test. This means that this dictionary can be intercepted, can be used in our actual application. And based on env test, it can switch between the pet adoption production service and the fake service. Now, in order to create those services, and instead of adding all the code over here, it would be a good idea to create some sort of a factory that can allow us to create a particular service based on the environment value. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I will say factories. Inside the factory, I'm just going to go ahead and add a new file, and we can say web service factory. You can name anything you want, but I think it's descriptive enough. Web service factory. The web service factory will have only one function at this point, which will be create. It is going to return you a web service protocol. Now, based on the environment value that is being sent from the UI testing, we should be able to switch between the fake authentication service and the pet adoption service. In order to get the environment values, we will use processinfo.process info.environment and whatever the key that we have provided, which in this case it's env. If the environment is equals to test, then we will go ahead and return you a fake authentication service. Else, if it is not that, then we will go ahead and return you a pet adoption service. Now we can go ahead and start using the web service factory create function to create and return the appropriate authentication service. Let's go ahead and jump into our actual app file. And inside the app file, we should be able to see which one do we want to return. So I'm going to go ahead and say web service factory equals to web service factory. And in our login screen, we need to pass in a login view model, which is fine. We can go ahead and pass in the login view model. And now we need to pass in the service, which can be generated by web service factory.create. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and run our test again. This time when we run the test, and since we are passing the launch argument of env, which is set to test, it is going to return us the fake service, which is perfectly fine, and we will bypass calling our production service, which was waiting for 5 seconds. And now you can see your test is much more faster because it does not really depend on the actual production service. We have just created it so that we can pass in a fake implementation as a dependency injection, and it will simply return you a true or a false value. Keep in mind that the fake authentication service that we have created is not called a mock, it's simply called a fake. And we are simply using it for our authentication service or for our UI testing so that we can quickly return true and get along or with our UI testing. So in this video, you learn about dependency injection, which allows us to pass in different concrete implementation based on the type, and we can interchange them or we can simply switch them around. You also learn about UI testing for SwiftUI, and also that you can create these fakes and pass in those fakes as dependencies. Thank you so much. Hey everyone, if you want to support my channel, then the best way would be to check out my new Patreon page. You can become a member for just $10 a month, and you will get access to all the different videos, articles, behind the scene, and even early access coupons. You can also go to Udemy and check out my courses over there. Thank you so much for your continuous support.